Hello, everyone. My name is Mike Griesel. I'm the Director of Architectural Masonry here at Brampton Brick. I'd like to personally welcome you to the 2021 conference and remind you to make sure you guys come visit us at the virtual conference lounge. I'll be hanging out at the virtual trade show booth, be happy to answer any questions you might have for me or show you some of the new products we have for 2021. And fingers crossed that next year we'll be able to share the same event space and mingle amongst some of our friends and colleagues. Over the years, Brampton Brick has been a major sponsor of the OA conferences. I feel it's critical to stay connected with the design community, especially when we manufacture products that don't only contribute to the performance of a building, but can have a huge impact on the overall aesthetic. This year, we're proud to be a title sponsor at the conference, and this go around, we're sponsoring the plenary panel discussion. This year's discussion will be the value of zero investing in carbon-free design. Of course, there's been a number of carbon-related products and technologies come to fruition over the last few years, and certainly as a manufacturer of masonry and hardscape products, we've recognized the challenges and some changes that are happening in today's built environment. This is why the lunch and learn topic I chose to present at this year's conference was focused on our carboclave technology, which is sequestering CO2 into our concrete block. So at this time, I'd like to invite the OA President, Susan Spiegel, to kick off the festivities. Take it away, Susan. See you guys later.
Oh, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. And thank you very much for being with us today. My name is Susan Spiegel, and though originally from Sudbury, I am a Toronto-based architect and president of the OAA, Ontario Association of Architects. And for those of you who may not know, the OAA regulates the practice of architecture in Ontario, and our primary purpose is to protect the public interest. As president, I lead our governing council, which guides the association's actions and initiatives. In addition to this mandate of protecting the public interest, this year council has three areas of focus: the planet in order of magnitude, the people, and the profession. Collectively, this includes climate stability, membership engagement, and comprehensive education. Above all, we are committed to viewing these priorities through a vigilant lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which has formed the theme for this year's OAA Virtual Conference, Cultivate Inclusivity. Today, we're going to hear from a group of experts about the many different advantages of low and net zero carbon buildings. I'm really looking forward to listening to today's conversation. I just want to take a quick moment to note that during today's presentation, we welcome you to submit questions via Zoom, the Q&A function, as well as through the comments section if you're joining us on YouTube. So to begin this morning's event, I would like all of us to take a few moments to recognize traditional lands upon which we are individually and collectively situated, coming together today from different geographical locations, from homes and offices, all located on the traditional Indigenous territories on this continent known as Turtle Island. So I invite all of you to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which you find yourself and to reflect on and recognize the significance of these territories to Indigenous people and on our mutual obligations to respect and share these lands. Now, I'm going to ask if you could put this a map slide up on the screen. This is a wonderful little initiative called nativeland.ca that is an expression of we're presenting as an expression of our commitment to truth and reconciliation. And it's a website that strives to map Indigenous lands in a way that changes, challenges, and improves the way that people see the history of their countries and their peoples. Nativeland.ca maps Indigenous territories, treaties, languages across the world in a way that goes way beyond colonial ways of thinking and better represents how Indigenous people want to see themselves. They provide great educational resources to correct the way that people speak about colonialism and indigeneity, and to encourage territory awareness in everyday speech and action. Thank you. Now, I would like to introduce the person who spearheaded today's panel, Barrie-based architect and OEA council member, Andy Thompson. Andy is the founder of Thompson Architecture Incorporated and has over 2 decades of experience in the field of green design and construction. Andy's energy, curiosity, intelligence, and tireless work as an activist and a writer bring a great deal to our work at the OAA and the world at large. I now hand it over to Andy to tell you a bit more about today's panel's discussion. Andy?
Thank you, Susan. My name is Andy Thompson. I'm an architect based in Barrie, Ontario, and as an OAA member, one of my roles is to offer input and collaboration with my colleagues to help share the direction for the profession. I'm just going to share a couple of images here. One topic that has stood out for me as of paramount importance is the discussion around climate stability. And the fact is, buildings, as they've been designed historically, are major contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. Buildings represent the largest slice of the climate impact pie at around 40% of all GHG emissions. This first image represents the value of all the world's currency and the value of all the world's stock markets combined on the right. Compare that with the value of the world's residential, commercial, and real estate values, and you will see at $216 trillion, these assets dwarf other markets. Here's the problem. We aim to halve global emissions, yet it has been estimated that we'll see a doubling of the footprint of global real estate by the year 2060, all while increasing the per capita area of our residences. As architects, we're charged with carrying out our professional duties in the best interest of the public. And it's our job to look at this urgent problem and design solutions. And we have been squaring this circle. There are incredible innovations. There are incredible innovations that are being designed and implemented in various parts of the globe. And we're now seeing designs that are so energy efficient, they produce more energy than they consume. It's not magic, it's architecture. So this begs the question, why aren't these designs being adopted more widely here in Canada and elsewhere? Oh, that's fine, there's no more slides. The sustainable design can generate tremendous long-term cost savings, and that's what we're here to talk about today. With that, I'd like to kick off the introductions. First, our moderator. Linda Nazareth is an economist, author, blogger, broadcaster, and speaker. She's a senior fellow for economics and population change at policy think tank Macdonald Laurier Institute and an expert in demographic and economic trends and the way that they shape our future, a topic explored in her latest book, Work is Not a Place. Linda is also the principal of Relentless Economics, Inc., and provides specialized economics research and consultancy services to organizations in the private and public sectors. Linda has worked as the senior economic analyst for the Business News Network as Canada's only full-time on-air economist, as a senior economist with CIBC and an economist with the federal government. And now over to Linda to introduce our speakers. Linda?
Thank you so much, Andy. Well, it's a real pleasure for me to be here. I'm really excited about this topic. As you heard, I've been an economist my whole career. I've worked for government, I've worked in finance and media. And these days, I really just think of myself as a communicator. I write books and a column for the Globe, but I'm in front of audiences a lot. And when I do that, I am trying to communicate how the world's going to change because of the mega trends. That's demographics and that's future of work, but it's also what's happening to our planet. Climate change and global warming. I'm going to confess, I shied away from talking about that for quite a while because I figured, I'm not a scientist, I'm not an expert on this. Should I really go there? And then I realized I had no choice because this is what's shaping our economy. And either we're going to just let it go and deal with the impact of that, or we're going to make smart choices, and that's going to have an economic impact too. So I have a new book coming out in the fall. It's called Where We Left Off, and I've been really spending a lot of time looking at climate emergency and what we can do, what we are doing, and how that's going to impact us. So for all those reasons, I'm really excited to be here this morning and hear from this amazing panel on this. I'm going to turn it over to them right now. And we're going to hear from each of them in turn about who they are and their work. I'm going to start with Jamie Gray-Donald. Now, Jamie is the current Senior Vice President, Sustainability and Environmental Health and Safety for Quadreal Property Group. From development through to asset management, Jamie finds ways that sustainability practices can enhance prudent growth and sustainable returns. He helps colleagues play effective roles in nurturing vibrant communities in residential and commercial environments. Now, Jamie was formerly the Vice President of Sustainability at Bentall Kennedy and the Associate Vice President Sustainability with Sears Canada, and as well has held various research positions. And Jamie holds a PhD in adult education from the University of Toronto, a Master of Arts in Geography from the University of Toronto, and a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy from McGill University. So Jamie, over to you.
Great, thank you, Linda. So I'd say how I'd start is in real estate, there's been a major change, and there's actually a lot of alignment in real estate. this started back in around 1999 with the advent of LEED, US Green Building Council and LEED. And over the next 10 years, there was really consensus that green buildings were something that were important. And a lexicon was created, standards were created, and a lot of movement happened there. When I joined Bentall Kennedy in 2012, we started ramping up green buildings to the point now where in Quadrille, we have a diverse portfolio, office, industrial, retail, residential. It's all green certified. And energy efficiency was the other banner. And so with those two banners, we got better. So, typically about 30% better on energy and better in the way we source materials, use less harsh chemicals. But I think even back in 2012, we realized that 30% probably wasn't enough. And it's taken, almost 10 years to get to the point where this notion of net zero is not a fringe notion anymore, where this notion of net zero is the new reality. It's what has to happen. And it's what governments are saying has to happen. So I think over 50% of governments have net zero legislation either in discussion or passed. And we're seeing at least a quarter of Fortune 500 companies with net zero commitments. And so we see a massive shift here. And the challenge is, what are we going to do? And so there are two challenges that I'm tackling. One is, what do we do with the existing buildings? So how do we decarbonize the operations of existing buildings? And that's a challenge that we haven't, most companies have not taken deeply, is fuel switching. So how do you get rid of natural gas from buildings across the portfolio? And that is, we've done it on a handful of buildings, but the skill sets don't typically exist. When you go, there is no study that says decarbonize my building. If you want an energy audit, you want an indoor air quality audit, you want a environmental, you've got those things. There isn't a standard thing you go to and say to an engineer, decarbonize it. And so I think that's coming. The second is there's a large amount of new development coming. We have a number of sites like Oak Ridge. That's about 4 or 5 million square feet that is replacing a shopping center. So about 10 residential towers, a bit of office, and about 500,000 square feet of residential. And how do you decarbonize that? So the initial is to do district energy. So we're doing electric boilers, geothermal, and so there'll be almost no natural gas on site. The next is how do you look at the embedded carbon in the buildings? And again, this is where science is still emerging. It's a lot of work to piece together the carbon footprint, and it's very hard to compare apples to apples. So we're looking at that space, but it's a complicated space. The third is where you have a more suburban location, there's solar potential. So looking at industrial buildings, warehouses that have large rooftops that aren't shaded, these are viable for solar. When you have downtown buildings that have a lot of shading and have smaller roof space, solar can be a challenge. So that's really what we've got ahead of us, are three streams of work: decarbonizing the existing portfolio, trying to put in alternatives to natural gas for heating in new developments, and then how to do alternative energy, solar on suburban assets. I'd say this is all for the commercial real estate sector tends to be very conservative. And I think Canadians often underestimate how conservative they are. And so these are movements that are needing external prompts. We're seeing these external prompts come from European investors. We're seeing these external prompts come from some government policies, particularly policies that are coming from New York City that are putting carbon taxes on carbon for existing buildings that are migrating across to possibly to Vancouver and Toronto. And it's these external prompts that will lead to change. At Quadrio, what we try to do is to be early adopters of those prompts. So let's not wait for the stick to come out. Let's be early and let's shape the standards that are used, and let's be transparent. So in, I think 2018, we published the carbon intensity of all the buildings in our portfolio publicly. And then we worked with the Canadian Green Building Council on a disclosure challenge to encourage other landlords to publish building level energy and carbon data. And that there are about a dozen companies that are doing that now. So we think that the marketplace that's transparent will perform better. And we encourage more to be transparent in that regard. I think my last comment I'll say is that when we build new buildings, the tendency is to do things like you did the one before. And so mechanical plans get carried forward. A lot of things get carried forward, and often the big questions aren't asked in early design meetings. And I think as architects, it's important to bring up those important questions on big developments that we had. Even though we have a 80% absolute carbon reduction goal by 2050, publicly posted, we talk about it. We have buildings that reach design stages where everything's natural gas. We're not above code on energy efficiency. And then I have to insert myself and unravel things. And if in the early meetings, architects who want to do this pitch and say, here's a way of doing it, clients, I think they won't automatically say yes, but I think that makes it a lot easier for us as clients to see that the architecture community has solutions and they're confident that they can make these things come true. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Now let's go to Tom Rand. Now, Tom's an entrepreneur, venture capitalist, author, and speaker. He's focused on carbon mitigation. He's co-founder and managing partner of Arcterm Ventures. He sits on the board of a number of clean energy companies and organizations. He also developed Planet Traveler. It's a low carbon hotel project in downtown Toronto, and is an award-winning best-selling author. His latest book is Climate Capitalism: Economic Solutions for a Planet in Crisis, that was published in early 2020. Tom holds a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering from the University of Waterloo, Master of Science in Philosophy of Science from the University of London and London School of Economics, and a Master of Arts and PhD in Philosophy from the University of Toronto. He's an Action Canada Fellow. He's been a member of a number of federal and provincial advisory boards, and he's also a regular contributor to Canada's leading op-ed pages and television. Tom?
Thanks very much. I really appreciate being included in today's discussion. And Jamie, I really took note of your comment around there's not really an existing textbook on how to decarbon a building. I think there are engineering techniques that the young up and comers are bringing to bear, and I think that's a really important thing. So that's a great note. So my role in this, I mean, aside from being a climate hawk like many of you, I really do two things that are related somewhat to this topic. I mean, the first, and I managing partner of Arcterm Ventures. So we are a clean tech venture fund. Our job is to invest in and bring forward kind of next generation climate tech, clean tech. And I think what's important about that, I'll give some examples, is it changes the options available to building designers and building operators and people who design cities, frankly. So technologies that feed in the next generation of optionality into design, whether it's an energy system or a building envelope or transportation or whatnot. So while there's a whole lot of stuff we can do with what's already been invented, and it's about deployment, the humble heat pump and all that kind of stuff, there is another generation of technologies that by increasing optionality really increase the design options, I think, for architects. So I'll give a few of those, and I'll contrast them to kind of yesterday's stuff, which is the other reason I think that I'm directly involved in this issue, which I did this Planet Traveler project, which was mentioned a little earlier, And I'll give some photographs to kind of show you the contrast between really what's coming down the pipe from this new tech arc-turny kind of stuff and what's the legacy stuff, which we know works, is tried and true, and can do some heavy lifting, but there are some differences. So I think a photograph would probably bring that to bear. I think I can just bring this up here. Boom. Arc turn, blah, blah. So this is old school. This is a building I was involved in. This is a retrofitted, fully retrofitted, gutted building on College Street. You can drive by and see it. It's not huge, but I'm with my partner, quite proud of it. It's a hotel for young people. And what we did was, I was a total neophyte, right? I had no idea how to build a low carbon building. I was like, we're gonna put wood stoves in the bedrooms. I didn't have any idea, to be honest. But as a motivated owner and a climate hawk, it turns out it's not rocket science, right? Which everybody I think on this call knows. All you really need to do is, we just integrated in one building a whole bunch of bog standard stuff, right? This is 12 years ago. So we have geo exchange, we have some solar thermal, some solar PV, even you can read the words, power pipe. So grab some heat before it goes down the drain and put it back in the hot water tank, and some LED lighting. That's it. There's nothing innovative really about anything on that list, with the exception maybe of the geo, because what we did was the building takes up the whole footprint of the land. There's 0 square feet for geo. So we actually got an agreement with the city of Toronto to put geo in the laneway that runs beside the building, which is city owned. And as a result of that project, there is now a process at the city of Toronto where you can bury geo under any public property. You got to get it approved and so on. But when we first approached the city, a fellow by the name of Steven Sudak was working there. I don't know if he's still there or not. You know, I talked about boreholes, and he didn't know what I was talking about in terms of geo, but he figured it out. And there was obviously, David Miller was the mayor at the time. Clearly, they were looking for opportunities to enable developers and citizens to step up on the climate game. So he said, well, why don't we do this, the 9 approvals, let's set up a process to do this. Anyway, so that was the only innovative thing in this building. And I used this building as a bit of a soapbox, frankly, to talk about the potential of lowering our emissions at a profit. And I was cash flow positive for doing this because the cost of the capital deployment on the thing. So it was like a no-brainer. I said, everyone in Canada should be doing this. The rule of thumb is roughly, you can get a 3/4 cut in carbon by unlocking 5% of the building's capital in a retrofit, and Bob's your uncle. And I thought that would just solve the problem. Of course, it's much harder than that, as everyone here knows, but the proof point was there. And that was just me as a neophyte going into this game. What's different now, and this is a picture of, and I'm not doing this as a plug, the Ontario Association of Architects walks the talk, and this is the headquarters of that institution. And what you're seeing here is the integration of light guides into solar. So here's the rooftop. You can see traditional solar panels around the outside, and there's an atrium. So what you can do now is, because these light guides essentially can change the direction of light in meaningful ways inside a sort of a saran wrap thin optic, you integrate that into bricks, blinds, slats. You can retrofit a south-facing wall. And here's the benefit, that you are now allowing aesthetics to shine, right? You're letting in ambient light. You have multiple value propositions because you're blocking direct light, you're changing the thermal load on that building, and you happen to produce some electricity. And you produce actually more electricity than the other bog standard solar panels, which essentially just create a dark cave. There's a kind of a funny little bonus. You can turn them in reverse at night and make some LED lights, because they're these high-tech little chips that work through the optics. So the point I'm making here is that solar is no longer just a big old panel, and you're not as limited to your roof anymore, and you're not limited in blocking all interesting light. You can let in ambient light. There's buildings in Ottawa that are being retrofitted with solar bricks and slats on the interior of the building, which is a retrofit and does the same kind of thing. Allows an architect or a designer to retain some ambient light and retain some aesthetic control over that building or that facade, while generating some electricity and changing the thermal load. So that's solar all grown up. That's a Toronto-based company, Morgan Solar. Here's an example where something is hidden. So the aesthetics is gone. And this is essentially a company out of Vancouver. They can drill, a mile deep inside a parking garage, which means you can retrofit geo inside, KingSett Capital's buildings downtown, CIBC Tower. Like if you can drive into the parking garage, you can drill long as there's no subway there. You can drill a mile down, you can put in geo. So you can retrofit geo inside a building, which is fundamental. So the technology means it just operates in 7'2" of headroom. And then what these people are doing is they're actually integrating buildings across a zone. So you can exchange heat into different buildings, because the heating loads of building are different at different times of day, and they have different occupancies and so on. So if you can share heat between buildings, you drill sideways, now you've got a design constraint that's eliminated, because you can share thermal loads over larger areas. So that's a couple of examples of how GeoExchange has grown up, solar's grown up. There's others. I mean, there's a company down in, this occurred to me while you were talking, Jamie. There's a company down in San Fran called Blue Planet. We're taking an early look at. They essentially sequester carbon dioxide out of a stack, right? So they're carbon capture on a coal plant or a gas plant or a cement plant, and essentially turn that CO2, they calcinate it, turn it into rock, which is aggregate. And we know what aggregate is used for. Aggregate is used in concrete. The challenge with a lot of the carbon negative or carbon lowered, they're not carbon negative, cement, is you're changing the physical structure. And that's a very conservative industry, as you point out. The last thing people want to do is get rid of Portland cement, and you're talking about structural integrity. So this company just says, fine, use Portland cement. You can take my highly negative carbon rocks, aggregate sand, shove it into the concrete, and you can become carbon neutral or even carbon negative. So there's really some interesting stuff coming down the pipe. That's the end of my slideshow. But really, I just want to kind of bring those pieces together. I've always argued that it's a matter of deployment now on climate, right? If you think innovation's enough, I give you the humble heat pump. Why isn't the heat pump in every building when it's economically viable and all the rest of it? Because there's all kinds of barriers to adoption. So technology is not enough. Yet technology is also expanding the operational and design space for folks like you, the architects and engineers in the world. And I hope to have many, many more of these coming down the pipe with my colleagues. And that's what I have to say. Thanks for listening.
Thanks so much, Tom. We're going to go over to Lisa King now. Lisa is the Senior Policy Planner for the City of Toronto's City Planning Division. She's also an award-winning sustainability practitioner in both the public and private sectors, integrating sustainability principles into land use and strategic planning policy and processes. She specializes in sustainable design, climate change, energy, and resilience policy and standards. She's also been central in developing the Toronto Green Standard, tiered sustainable performance measures for new construction, and Toronto's zero emissions buildings framework. Lisa completed her graduate work in environmental studies at Antioch University Midwest with a focus on policy and community planning. And she also has an undergraduate degree from Western University. Lisa, over to you.
Great, thank you, Linda. And it's great to hear these introductory remarks. They're already inspiring. I mean, I think just starting to see the components and what's possible in buildings and technologies, just start to mainstream net zero is really where we want to go. And how do we best do that? How do we best accelerate the idea of the zero emissions building? For me, I work in the new construction sector primarily, but in the City of Toronto, we have a large climate change action plan like many municipalities do and should have, and with aggressive targets for the city as well. So, following suit with the federal level, the provincial levels of government and those targets. But in Toronto, in the largest city in Canada, buildings account for over half of our emissions, with transportation taking, a second place, and then waste. So we have an even bigger focus on the building sector, and of course, the existing building sector and the renovations of buildings is going to be the majority of that work. However, the new construction is leading the way, and as Jamie mentioned, a lot of this sort of I guess movement, you could say, in Toronto, maybe it started in the late part of, maybe around 2009, 2010, when the LEED standards were coming in, and they have made, a tremendous impact, of course, on market transformation. And in the City of Toronto, we decided to focus in on our own set of green building and site standards, so technical standards that prioritize what we thought was important. And under Mayor Miller, who was also mentioned already, so that, that kind of championing that leadership is really important at the political level when trying to move these things forward. We were asked to really try to figure out how we could make this standard mandatory in Toronto so that it applied to all new construction. And we have some of the largest, levels of growth happening, certainly in this country, but in North America still. And in terms of big, large buildings as well, the biggest emitters. And what we did was we created a 2-tier standard. And so tier 1 is mandatory and tier 2 is voluntary, but it has a significant refund on development charges paid. And the reason I mention that is because it creates this sort of market push and market pull kind of scenario. And I see the TGS as like a flexible regulation. So I'll see if Tom agrees or not. But in that, it's quick to respond to the industry in terms of what we can put into the standard and prioritize. It's quicker than, for example, a regulation that takes many years and has a very, long regulatory process to prepare it. So we can be responsive, and we've been able to do that. So every 4 years, for example, we've been able to ratchet up the performance levels in those standards. Now, working with the building industry, and especially the green building industry, who has been a huge supporter of this. But without that financial incentive, I don't know that we would have had that same impact and success. So we have 58 certified high performance projects now, and many coming in stream behind those. However, in 2016, 2017 is when we took a look at different jurisdictions around the globe, so in Europe and North America, at their energy codes and policies to say, how could we do better? How can we ratchet down emissions? How can we make sure that we're measuring energy performance in buildings the best way to have the best outcomes and results? And so some of those jurisdictions around the globe that are real leaders are the EU directive, which asked for nearly zero buildings by 2020. So we're already a decade behind Europe. France is now asking for energy positive buildings as of 2030. So there's some real leaders there, and also in Canada too, and Vancouver has been the real leader that we look to in Canada, but also California is a leader, so different jurisdictions. And we created a zero emissions building framework that you mentioned, which has step targets. So like a step code in BC out to 2030, which is the date that we really feel is essential to have all new construction delivered as a zero emissions building. And really our modeling on our climate change plan, which is coming out soon, is showing that we could even be more aggressive than that to meet our citywide targets. I mean, it's a really big challenge for us. So we've been trying to implement that framework. And as we move on to the next Toronto Green Standard version, which is 2022, we need to, again, move up another step or tier in terms of what we're requiring. And that is difficult for buildings. I would argue that it is difficult to deliver, and especially on large multi-family buildings. That's a really challenging sector. And so this quandary that we have about how do we make the business case for these buildings, and how do we get more of them delivered is of great interest to us at the City of Toronto. It really has to do a lot with the ownership model, seems to be, where you can make that case. You see what I see in the new standards we have and the high performance targets are that it's the office, institutional buildings, and the affordable housing that are able to step up first. And that's really fabulous. And it may be that the affordable housing actually has some of the best housing first with the lowest emissions in Toronto. So what I'm interested in the discussion today and to talking about how we can mainstream this more so as such an important discussion of the day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And we're going to go to our final panelist this morning, Joanne Mccallum. Joanne's a co-founder and CEO of Mccallum Sather. It's a Hamilton-based practice founded 25 years ago on the principles of sustainable design. It's now a leader in the field. As a thoughtful advocate for sustainability, Joanne works with business leaders, entrepreneurs, developers, colleagues in the engineering consulting industry, demonstrating how data-driven solutions can deliver advanced sustainable design outcomes in affordable ways. Her significant history in sustainable design includes groundbreaking projects, including the RAIC award-winning design of the Joyce Center for Partnership and Innovation at Mohawk College in partnership with BH Architects, which achieved net zero certification for energy and performance, the first in Canada. Joanne?
Well, thank you. That's really amazing stories and experience that I've been listening to from, Jamie and Tom and Lisa. So it's a bit of a hard act to follow, but I just want to put a little context to my career. I went to the University of Calgary. I was there in the late 70s, early 80s, because I was really attracted to the Faculty of Environmental Design. And it had architecture, urban planning, and environmental science, all in one faculty. And truly that paved, I think, my career in terms of learning about working in its integrated design teams. And I've really called on that experience over the years. It seems really simple. It's actually very challenging. But when we started the firm in 1996, our goal was all about sustainable design. And it just seemed intuitively obvious to me that people would be lining up to hire us as their architects, because we're here saying, listen, we can actually design you a building that is, very healthy. It's less costly to operate, and it's not going to cost you any more capital dollars. Well, I can assure you it didn't quite work out that way. But it's been a very interesting journey and a lot of lessons learned over the past 25 years. And I would have to say that very rarely has there ever been a client pay a capital premium for an energy efficient project. What it takes is collective intellect and the pursuit of a common goal. So I want to share a couple of projects that we've done, and I'll go through them quickly, but maybe just in response to some of the conversations I've heard so far this morning, a couple of observations. Discussions, in my experience, discussions and analysis about engaging developers and owners to pursue sustainable design, based on appealing to ethics or morality or the common good or concern for future generations has rarely, if ever, been a convincing argument. It's always come down at the end of the day to conversations around money. And there's a significant mistrust on the part of, owners and developers about the analysis, about modeling, and about projections. What they really have been focused on is what has been done. I think, Tom, you alluded to that, what has been done, as opposed to what can be done. So I think that having said that, I'm going to try to share my screen. Tell me if this works. Do you see it?
Yes.
It's there? Okay. So what is a net zero building? Let's just start with a very quick primer that a net zero energy, net zero carbon, it's highly energy efficient buildings that produces off-site or procures carbon-free renewable energy in amount sufficient to offset the annual carbon emissions. This is a definition from the CAGBC. So really, it's very energy efficient buildings that can generate as much energy as they utilize, and then that is about the energy, and then the carbon is about, at this time when we do certification, it is about the carbon in your building materials and your fuels and your fuel sources. So net zero ready means that you have a building which can be easily converted to be net zero energy or net zero carbon. And I have an example of that. So a lot of that, this is particularly relevant for retrofits where it's difficult in the short term to maybe do a net zero energy building or net zero carbon, but you can put a lot of the technology in place that can be converted in the future. The thing about, looking at net zero design is you really do need to look at buildings a little bit differently. You need to really consider the building envelope relative to the building systems, relative to the occupant behavior. So there's a very synergistic kind of relationship between these three major concepts. Traditionally, architects have looked at functional programs and relative to the estimated budgets, and they've had very little correlation sometimes, the budget and the program, but that is what has driven design. So going forward into doing net zero design, You need to look at things very differently. You need to start hopefully with an energy budget. I think we are all used to talking about energy use intensity now. And use that as a framework for making decisions. So when you do that, you establish what that budget is, and then you make the decisions about what you're doing with your building envelope, how you're going to create those systems. That humble heat pump that Tom was alluding to factors into this a lot. But how you can trade off one to the other to make something very energy efficient, and think about how that occupant behavior is going to feed into it, because we're so used to free energy. We're so used to going into a coffee shop or plugging in. Well, we used to be able to go into the coffee shop, but to go in and plug in and never think about who's paying for that electricity. So going forward into a more net zero world really requires that we become conscious of our behavior and how we interact with the buildings that we build. There's several very simple tactics to really reduce the energy use in a building and to reduce your carbon. We always start off with thinking about a baseline building which meets the building code requirements, or the SB 10. And essentially that is a building that you can legally build. And then we look at all the different ways in which passive technologies can be thought about. So where the site, the orientation on the site, the form of the building, natural ventilation, natural light, all of those things when integrated into thinking about that building can have a significant impact on the need for that technology to drive your building systems. So having factored that in, then let's look at how those actual mechanical electrical systems are going to work. How do we develop that synergistic relationship between the systems, the envelope, the natural flows? Then we bring in occupant behavior. And by using those, simple tactics, we have significantly reduced already your energy requirements for a building. And the final piece is then what can we do when it comes to adding renewable energy to that so that we can augment any emissions. So those are just simple tactics. And a couple of examples that I'll show you where we've used this very successfully. And this was the Joyce Center for Partnership and Innovation, which we partnered with B+H Architects on. This is a building in Hamilton at Mohawk College. And the way in which we achieved, I think, a very remarkable outcome for this building, because it was done in an incredibly short length of time, but we had a very intense integrated design process. At our very first meeting, we established an energy budget. It was very aggressive. Establishing that energy budget meant that that was based on a lot of knowledge about what the building typology itself, which was lecture halls and labs, what they typically would use in terms of energy, and then where do we need to go to actually bring this down to a net zero baseline. And that drives your decision making. So we really looked at the things that I talked about, the orientation, the building envelope, the systems, and what our renewable opportunities were. Here, because it's a campus, we had more roofs. So it was, in fact, quite a small footprint for the roof, but we were able to capitalize on adjacent buildings. So our mechanical and electrical systems, it was a geothermal system, heat pumps, actually 30% of the cost of the overall building construction. The penthouse itself was extremely small, just 4,000 square feet. And critical to the operations of this, of course, was to have commissioning, measurement, and verification after as well to ensure that you are achieving your targets. And there was a lot of work around the culture shift as well with the students and educating them about a net zero building, and really kind of managing plug loads. So talk is always around cost. This building started out as 47 million. That was our capital budget. We had a budget of $525 a square foot, 90,000 square feet was our program. Our final cost was 47.6 million. Our final program was 96. So it grew by 6,000 square feet, but our actual final unit cost came down to $492 a square foot. And we have an equivalent kilowatt hour per meter square yearly or annually, EUI of 75, which is exceptionally low. And that 75 was offset by our solar panels, net zero. Actually, we've been trending as net zero positive. So I would just say, using that example, it's not about the money. It's not about the money. It's really about bringing that intelligence together and working together and solving problems together. We did a similar process for the Westinghouse, which is an old heritage building in Hamilton, had been abandoned for 30 years. We were the architects for renovating this building and using a lot of existing materials that were still in the building, so saved a tremendous amount about embodied energy. We've done a lot of calculations on that, which I won't go into today. But what's important when you're doing net zero buildings is that you do the analysis. So we looked at 5 options against a baseline. And this is where I will go back to saying, we could show that using option 2, which was all electric, was actually the least expensive to build and cost a few cents more a square foot to actually operate. But it wasn't chosen because of that fear of going to an all electric building. There was a sense that we know that gas is proven, we've been using it, it's inexpensive, we need to do this. So they went with option 1, which was a distributed heat pump system, water loop heat pump system, but it's a gas-fired boiler. But it has been designed so that the boiler could be retrofitted in the future for electricity. What's really interesting, and I'm not going to dive into the numbers because I don't have time. I just want to show that there is a significant amount of analysis that needs to be done to really look at how you do the trade-offs for the building systems. Here we're demonstrating the equivalent kilowatt hours for each of the options, the how much greenhouse gases are being emitted. So it goes from the typical baseline of 17.76 kilograms per meter square down to what's the lowest? 3.49. There's a significant difference. Now this will factor in the future when carbon tax really starts to impact the decision making. And in terms of annual energy costs, this one we were looking at just different square foot costs. But this is the important thing here. And I think actually that second slide might have been a duplicate, but the blue part and the little blue arrow and the little red arrow here is showing the impact of carbon tax. When we first did this analysis, we were looking at no tax and then up to $100. So it was still hard to kind of justify going to an all electric system, even with a $100 carbon tax, if you're only interested in that operating cost around the fuel efficiency. But when you start to factor in, as we've been talking about recently, $130 a ton to $150 in 2030 to $300 for 2050, it makes a huge difference. And this is the kind of intelligence I believe that we really need to bring to the discussion in terms of showing people why and how to make the shift. Why it makes sense now, we can demonstrate that it costs the same, and it will cost you less in the future. So I think that the financial analysis is not that difficult to do if you just work together and go through it. So I'm just going to end on this. Critical to have an energy budget when you're doing net zero buildings. Critical to have an integrated design team because you have to solve these problems together. They're not done in isolation and they're not done in a linear fashion. There's a lot of feedback loops. And you need to start with a realistic budget. So often budgets are, as I said before, they sometimes are disconnected from the program. I'm not sure how budgets are derived sometimes. It's a big question mark. But start with the right budget, which gives you the flexibility to make a lot of different decisions. And you can do it all with proving technologies, although I'm really excited about some of the new technologies that have been alluded to that are just, further advancements of what we already have. And use energy model and data to really drive the design. And you can achieve net zero targets on budget. You can reduce your energy costs. You can future-proof your building with regard to whether it's carbon tax or however they're going to package it. It's going to come, and there are a lot of opportunities coming up with grants and incentives. So I hope I've been able to demonstrate that there's nothing to stop us as architects, as policymakers, as urban planners, to really do some amazing work.
Thank you so much, Joanne. Let's bring everybody back into this. There's so many great ideas already put out there. I'm going to ask everybody about their wish list. If we can go forward 5 years, what would you like to see that Ontario has accomplished in terms of moving to green buildings? I'm going to ask everyone to just keep it to a 1-minute answer. So really just your wish list. Start with Jamie.
I think the Toronto's green standard is great, and the BC step code. So I think taking a step level code like that to a provincial level would be fantastic. And if I can add another, would just be continued education of the various trades and professions on the possibilities of net zero.
Tom?
Well, I think we've seen over the last 12 to 18 months throughout the investment community a normalization of discussions around climate risk. It's a very different world today than it was 2 years ago in the financial world. It would be great if within the built environment that same normalization occurred. So early actors, and there's many of them, there's some on this panel, there's many in the audience, that behavior becomes normalized. Having hacked the path through the jungle, shown the financial viability, shown the technical viability, et cetera, that non-climate hawks, people who don't care, endorse and behave in this kind of way because it becomes a social norm within the community. This would be great.
Lisa, from your point of view as a planner, what's your wish list?
Well, I'd have to agree in terms of the building code taking up really high levels of energy and GHG performance and aligning with the national energy code that's coming out. So we'll see that that's really important. But a lot of municipalities don't really have the authorities to set the bar higher as they need to. And so it's really important that at the provincial regulatory level, that ability is provided. And so they have been asking for that for some time. So on the regulatory side, there's lots of things we can do and more on disclosure requirements and things like that. But really, for me personally, what I would like to see is that we have enough examples, real examples across the different building types that we see, being developed of high performance, low emissions buildings that we can point to and we can share that information. It's enough to create that tipping point that we need. In 5 years, it has to be, or we'll never be able to implement those regulations at 2030.
Okay. And finally, Joanne, your 1-minute wish list.
Lisa, I really like what you just said, because I had it in my notes here that once there's enough buildings that are actually built to get people over that hurdle of what has been to what can be, it's going to be huge. For us as professionals, as architects and engineers, what I would love to see would be perhaps some incentives in terms of financial incentives to help architectural and engineering teams do the proper analysis. It's something that's been very, very hard to get owners to want to do. So I think we need to really feed into the whole kind of purchasing food chain and really be able to provide we want to be able to bring our intelligence to the table, and we need help to do that. We need assistance and incentives to help owners allow us to bring that intelligence and do the analysis and to develop the data.
Awesome. Lisa, I want to come back to something you mentioned earlier. You're talking about parts of the world that have impressed you as doing well and moving forward on these kind of initiatives. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, well, I mean, we have to give kudos to the city of Vancouver because now they have had some additional abilities in that they're a charter city, but to set out high performance requirements earlier than rest of Canada. And because of their green city ambitions, you know, they've really managed to do that and, you know, have requirements for passive house level now in their local building code. So, and the BC STEP code, you know, allows the different jurisdictions to choose the tier of energy performance that they want to come in at. And so that's a really interesting regulatory tool. Others are, yeah, as I mentioned, I mean, there's the Swiss standards are, they stood out, I know, in our review. Again, have passive house level requirements, which is what our tier 4 is set at, by the way. It's near passive house levels. So yeah, California is another great one that has been a leader over time. And of course, New York City, you can't leave New York City out. Jamie mentioned New York. It's difficult because we don't find we have the same abilities in Toronto to do some of the things that they're doing around requiring disclosure on buildings, for example. So having leaders like Quadrille, you know, being willing to share their portfolio data on performance is really important too, to move that along.
Thank you. I want to talk about the investment side of this because investors presumably have opportunities to be involved in the sector. I'll direct this, I guess, to Tom. If you are an investor talking to your advisor, what are the things you should be looking for? What are the questions you should be asking?
So as a sort of a citizen investor, I think your options are somewhat limited because you have at your disposal the kinds of financial tools that Bay Street and Wall Street have already developed. And there are some that are responsive to climate risk, that, you know, there's ETFs and so on. But I think what's really important is that the financial community begin to work harder to develop financial instruments that are available to the everyday investor, right? I mean, there was some great work by a company, it's not Solar Share, I can't remember. Anyway, there was bonds you could buy as a citizen that paid 7 or 8% in solar projects. And so they aggregated demand from the public and built solar projects. Could be on commercial roofs, could be community solar and so on. Solar Share. So that's one tool for the general public. I think a lot more work needs to be done to give the public more options. But as a sophisticated investor, you know, as you're an accredited investor or you're an institutional investor, I think it is now absolutely de rigueur to not just talk about climate risk, but now we need to go a step further and say, what are the kinds of ways in which we as investors can push and move the needle to solve this problem rather than just being defensive to it? So I differentiate between playing defense and playing offense as an investor. If the whole Mark Carney just believes if everyone knew about climate risk, then the financial community would solve the problem. And the problem with that statement is that if everyone was aware of climate risk to a highly granular level, say building by building, city by city, asset by asset, you would play defense. You would move your capital out of condos in Miami and you'd build a t-shirt factory in Guangzhou or something. That's protecting your assets. And that's what an individual investor would do. Going on offense, where you move your capital into deploying solutions, wind farms, building retrofits, this one is a very different prospect. And so getting better data around the financial upside of things like energy retrofits, I think is really important. The final point on that, I mean, CFOs are trained not to use capital budgets except for strategically important things. If you own a t-shirt factory, you use your capital budget for more t-shirt machines, essentially. You don't use your capital budget to retrofit your factory to make it more energy efficient because that's not a strategically central piece on your income statement. If CFOs were just taught that your energy costs, your carbon risk exposure are strategically important, you'd unlock your capital budget. And there's no CFO, no CEO on this planet that can get 30% returns on their core capital, 15% returns on their core capital. That's like this on an energy efficiency project, right? So the irony is everyone would be doing better as a CEO and CFO to look at energy costs as being strategically important because you unlock your capital budget and you're going to improve the returns on your core capital in that way. So I think that's where the dynamics really come into play.
You can get a lot of people's attention by talking about 30% returns.
Yeah.
Yes. Joanne, you mentioned earlier that you'd like to see incentives to do the right things. we're going to come out of this pandemic with these gigantic deficits. Governments are going to be really careful about how they spend their money. What would be your argument for them to do these things? And what are the things you'd like to see done?
Oh, well, my argument would be the same argument I've had for 25 years. I can actually save you money. You know, it's great. Even in our office here, which we're in the Westinghouse, and we get a check back every year because on our operating costs, because first of all, the property managers really didn't believe our numbers, so they run a certain set of figures, and then at the end of the year, we go through it and we get money back, which is nice. But I think that the most important thing really is we're talking about saving money. The investment is in the intellectual capital that goes into thinking through the problems. That's a tiny, tiny drop in the bucket relative to the quality of building that is done, relative to the long-term operational costs, relative to the long-term other fringe benefits of, you know, health and wellness, productivity, et cetera, that we've all been witness to through, you know, doing LEED projects and, you know, well certification, et cetera. So it's just that it is longer term thinking, which is hard to factor into kind of a 4-year political cycle. But the incentives really that I think about are, if people here who can go back to the CBET program, which Enercan ran in the late 90s, started in 1998, and it was an incentive program that provided owners with enough money based on the savings they were getting from energy savings to be able to pay for people to do energy modeling and to do kind of synergistic system design. That is peanuts financially in terms of the long-term benefit. So that's the kind of scenario that I think would be a huge benefit and go a long way just to helping the profession be able to deliver really smart buildings.
Hopefully it happens. The long-term thinking in politics are going to be a challenge, I think, in the next little while. You know, I want to open this up to everyone else. I know, you know, you can put in your questions and we will put them to the panelists. We have a few already, so I'm going to start with one to Jamie. It says, in response to a point Jamie made, are we not the second highest GHG emitters in the world per capita, according to the CBC?
I think I don't know the statistics specifically, but it sounds about right. We're geographically dispersed countries, so there's a lot of transportation. We're cooler, so there's a lot of heating, and historically energy efficiency has not been high on the agenda. So I think it shows the opportunity. To Tom's point, we're seeing, you know, to do a 30% energy reduction in a building, you're often getting a 30% internal rate of return. So the money's there. It is really that, how do you capture the attention? I think it's just, my answer would be, there's a world of opportunity, and for people to design better and to do retrofits to capture that opportunity.
Thank you. I'm going to have a longer question. Bear with me while I read it and we'll see who wants to take it. Until the OBC code changes, do you think it will be difficult to achieve better energy targets? And from the person writing this, I have found most clients want to do the minimum allowed to pass regulatory approval. But what is helping are the new Toronto green standards. However, this is only applicable to new developments in Toronto. How do we move the discussion forward and convince clients to pursue the better targets and build better? A kind of a follow-up to what we've been discussing. Who'd like to comment on that one?
Well, I can take a stab at it to start with anyways, and others can jump in. You know, when we establish the targets that we have, which include capped GHG emissions, and something that's referred to as heating demand, and then the total energy use intensity, we established those targets by building type, and looked at, you know, what the synergies were, what were the benefits of those targets, the other multiple benefits. So one of those was the resilience. So thermal comfort is a big sell, first of all, when it comes to, when you talk about passive house or, you know, high performance buildings in general, they're well insulated, comfortable spaces, which means you can maximize the use of space internally. which is important when you're planning out a building and looking at returns. But they're resilient to extreme weather. So extreme heat, extreme cold, and we actually did some modeling where we looked at what would happen in a hypothetical 2-week power out in the, dead of winter, basically in February. And we found that, a tier 4, so the nearly emissions building would hold its indoor unit temperature at about 18 degrees C. Now, if you compare that to a code building, it would hold its indoor temperature at about 1 degree C. So there's quite a big advantage there. And that's just, the building side of planning for resilience. So these are high performing, very high quality interior spaces to live in as well. And these are the selling points that they tend to be hidden, and we need to bring them out more in the discussion.
Anybody else want to comment on that one?
I could just quickly, I've always been notoriously pessimistic on climate. I'm not as pessimistic anymore because, the risk is still real, and we're not going to stop at 1.5. But the attitude of the business community is very different, as I said before. 5 years ago, even 3 years ago, if you gave a corporate leader 2 options, one was low carbon and one was baseline standard. Unless the low carbon option was 1/10 of the cost, half the cost, better performing, they wouldn't do it because there was professional risk. And again, there's just momentum. Like, I just do what I did yesterday. I worked yesterday, leave me alone. Today it's different. If you give a corporate leader 2 options, one is a low carbon option and one is a high carbon option, and they're the same cost, I would argue that the majority of corporate leaders would take the low carbon option today. And why is that? Culture's changed. I think a little Swedish girl has a lot to do with it. A lot of conversations around family dinner tables of corporate leaders around, are you a climate hero, mom, or are you a villain? So the culture is changing. So I would bring a little bit of an optimistic note there and say, you just have to make sure it works. You just have to make sure it pays for itself. Just make sure you button down those risks, but it can be equal cost now, which is very different from even 2 years ago.
That's encouraging to hear. There's a very direct question to Joanne here. I saw a very large surface parking at the Mohawk College building. How is that factored in the overall emissions count?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Sure. It's from somebody saying, I saw a very large surface parking at the Mohawk College building. How is that factored in the overall emissions count?
Mohawk is actually in the process of putting in solar panels over most of their parking area. But that actually didn't factor into our building because parking wasn't part of the equation. There was already enough parking on the campus. We were not adding any parking. But it is, they are in the process of moving forward with electrifying that entire campus, which is awesome. I'd also like to say, and I agree with you, Tom, I think we're reaching a tipping point. We've got a number of net zero projects underway right now. And because there is enough to demonstrate that you can do it at no additional cost, at least no additional capital cost or minimal capital cost. But people are institutionally, when they have control of their decision-making, are making decisions that are very impactful because they do care. And I'm beginning to sense a little bit of that on the hardest sector, which is the multi-use residential, outside of affordable housing, which have been leaders in this. On the private sector, it's been extremely challenging, but we've certainly in talks with different developers who are really starting to really think about geothermal and what they're going to do. I mean, for them, if you're building a condo, in a year after it's built, they're gone. So, but there's a shift, and I think we need to educate the public. If you buy a car, the energy efficiency of your car. So we as professionals, we need to be talking about some of the data that drives design. We need to be talking about EUIs. It needs to come into the common language. So it's kind of interesting because it's relative. If you think you go out and you're buying an appliance, it'll tell you, what the inner guide is now. And it might say 90 kilowatts or whatever, and all we go is, oh, that's good. But we actually don't know what it is good relative to. So I think we need to really be very conscious about educating our clients around a whole different set of data in terms of understanding their buildings, their building performance. And that again will really help change the narrative, I believe. Well, that's a long way from the parking lot. Sorry, Linda.
That's all good. Direct question here for Jamie. Have you requested of your architects that LCA embodied and operational carbon are all part of procurement requirements? And since BIM now lets us automate export of this data.
So we have built a tool to look at operational carbon over the lifetime of assets. So we take the TEDI, the TUI, and the greenhouse gas intensity, the size of properties, and then the percent better than code in terms of low carbon energy systems, and then also differences in waste management. And so we're populating that for all of our development projects and looking at lifetime carbon. So that's I can sort of tick that box, and that's very recent. On life cycle, we're starting to in Vancouver. There are a couple of projects where that's coming. We have guidance already for our development projects on using low carbon concrete and recycled steel are sort of the two major, to the single biggest components of most developments. And so those are good opportunities. I think there's rapidly shifting conversations and development in code for mass timber buildings. So we're through our mortgage group, we're financing a mass timber, I think an 8-story mass timber office in the US. And some of our peers are doing a mass timber office in Vancouver. So we looked really to mass timber as a really neat option. We've seen some mass timber warehouses in Europe. Haven't seen that in Canada yet, but would be excited if that would come. I think the engineering around that is fascinating. So a lot of movement here, and I'd say that I struggle a bit with LCAs in the sense of how complicated they seem versus what the decision, how that affects decision points. And for me right now, sourcing the best concrete you can, the lowest carbon concrete you can, sourcing the lowest carbon steel are by far the biggest choices. And can you move to mass timber? Those are the big things. And I'd like to see LCAs get faster and enable people to focus on key decision points earlier.
Thank you. I have one here for Lisa or Tom to comment on. I'd love to know more about the process which the City of Toronto allows the geothermal under their property for adjacent buildings. Is this a request at SPA? What are the restrictions? What are the timelines for approval? We'll start with Lisa.
I haven't actually had to deal with that hands-on, so maybe Tom knows because he worked on it on a specific project.
Sure. Yeah, I actually haven't. So this was probably 10 years ago. We went through this process. I do know there are at least 6 other buildings that have gone through the same process. When I went through it, it took time because we were setting the process up to be replicable as opposed to a one-off. But it's the committee of adjustments. It's the usual kind of touch point for any kind of, I'm not a city expert, but you'll know this better than I do. So there's a department you go to for any kind of permitting that's outside the norm. And if you just identify it as a geo-exchange project under city land, you just get sucked into the process. It took me about 9 months to get approval, maybe 10 months. That's probably been shortened since we were doing it for the first time. So I haven't gone through it for a while, so I haven't got more detail than that.
Yeah, we are seeing geo exchanges becoming very prevalent on private building sites, definitely, and that's just dealt with through the regular approvals process. But lots of buildings turning to that as they try to electrify, for sure.
Yeah, I have a kind of a question for everybody. You've all alluded to selling this and making people aware of this. When you talk to people, do you get a pushback when you talk about going through a green lens? Is there terminology that's more acceptable or that we should be using to sell this any better? Anybody have a comment on that?
It's a really good question. I mean, we've all made the point that there is a financial payback here, that if you look at this through a purely rational lens, it makes sense. And so to me, that's always been like, well, then surely this ball will roll downhill. It doesn't. I think there are cultural norms, social norms, psychological, I mean, there's all kinds of resistances in the market that stop. We're not perfectly rational actors. That's a myth of the neocon Friedman world, right? We're not perfectly rational actors. We are embedded, embodied creatures with a set of interests that are personal to ourselves. We are rational within our own sets of currencies, as the guys from economics pointed out. That, you know, behavior that looks irrational is actually rational from a person's point of view, because their currency is not the common currency. It's a personal currency about reputation, about just, you know, what makes you get out of bed in the morning and so on. So I think we need to think about different ways to translate our core issues and concerns, which may be that of a climate hawk, it may be that of a designer, to the other person's language. Figure out what their currency is and talk to them in that currency. Sometimes it's reputational, right? There are some big real estate players out there that are now trying to compare who's the best at reducing the carbon footprint of their portfolios, right? I mean, Jamie, you know this. I mean, Cap Reach out there, and Starlight's getting in there, and Kingston Capital's in there. And I think they're, you know, now it's professional pride, because the CEOs and owners of those companies have gotten involved, and there's some pride now. So again, that's just an example of saying people aren't rational. They're rational from an objective perspective. They're rational from a personal perspective. So figuring out what their currency is and expressing this common desire to get to a low carbon, resilient, economically efficient state in that person's local currency is part of the challenge that everybody has, I think, who's in this game.
Anybody else want to comment on that?
Yeah, go ahead. Sure, I'll pick up on that. I have to learn everyone's language. So everyone in the company has a different language. Leasing has a language. Development has a language. Executives have a language. When I went to present to CalPERS, one of the bigger pension funds globally, I put together a presentation, and I was paired up with an investment manager, and she looked at it and she said, none of this makes any sense. All that matters is NOI. I looked at her and I was like, well, what's NOI? And she just went like this, got on her phone, tapped a bunch of stuff and said, you know, I need to go. I got back to my desk. My boss was like, what did you do? I got a message from Christine saying to fire you. And I was like, I didn't know what NOI was. She was like, oh, that's net operating income. It's essentially the profitability of buildings. It's the, you know, rent minus expenses. And so I quickly learned what NOI was, and NOI became the sustainability strategy. The sustainability strategy was increase NOI. And lo and behold, everyone got it, and we made a lot of progress. To Tom's point, I think the other thing I'd add is you have to get to know people individually. You know, which people have the legacy issue, which people are sort of, hey, I'm out of here in 5 years, and you know, what can we deliver that I can be proud of by the time I go, versus, you know, which are the people who are, you know, very rational and just need to see the numbers. And it's a one-on-one, and we have 1,200 people in the company, and it's a one-on-one conversation with at least 200 people that I have, that to get them, each individual person, to understand things in their own language.
If I could just add to that, just quickly, but one of the big challenges in the past has been the people dealing with capital and the people dealing with operating dollars were two different departments, and they didn't talk to each other, and they didn't care about each other. The people who were managing the capital dollars, their goal was to make sure that they didn't spend more, and they would probably get bonused if they spent less. And the people who were dealing with the operating dollars were just in a completely different field. So I think it's why that whole integrated design process is so important in terms of bringing those people together to find that common goal, that common language, and work together towards it.
Lisa, do you want to give a final thought on that question?
Well, what's running through my mind as everyone's talking is, I'm just curious to ask you back as a group, you know, how much is carbon pricing coming into the conversations on budgets and projections? And is that helping to bring those to the capital and operating planning together at all? That would be my hope.
Anybody want to comment on that?
I think many don't yet believe that the carbon pricing will continue to the one number. So none of us are yet penciling that number in. But all of us, I think all of us believe that investors will value this, so that investors see the risks, and they're not quite sure how to price that into valuations yet. But when they're actually buying a building, they are pricing these things in. And so there's this disconnect between valuation and actual sale price. But institutional investors are acutely aware of carbon risk. And there's just a fuzziness about what number do you use. Do you use 20, 30, 50, 170, 300?
300.
What I'd say is, if you move up the step code, you're essentially reducing the obsolescence of the building, is how I pitch it internally. Is you're saying we may spend a bit more, or it may be a more difficult process to build better, but we're essentially buying 4 years of 5 years avoided obsolescence. And when we sell it in 5 years or 10 years, our buyers are going to be smart enough to know how to price that. And that's been a pretty effective argument.
I want to move to more audience questions. We're getting a whole lot here. The cost, carbon in dollars, of using electricity varies across regions, and yet most analysis software seems to use aggregate Canada-wide data. Now, is there a better source of information? Interesting question. Anybody have a comment?
There are provincially posted numbers annually, so you can get the carbon intensity. I'd have to research where I get it. It's from our energy management provider, but it is publicly available data, updated annually for each province.
Yeah, since we're talking about the differences in regions, another question here. How do you approach net zero for building outside urban areas? I assume there's a difference. Are there particular considerations or challenges or advantages to doing things in the rural parts of the province as opposed to Toronto or bigger cities?
I'm trying to imagine why that would change things.
Well, what I was thinking about was, in the very dense urban environment, one of the issues, I think it was mentioned earlier, is just, space, shading. If you're actually trying to produce a net zero emissions building, you need to offset those remaining emissions from heating and cooling somehow. So you either have to purchase carbon offsets, or you need to provide some kind of, low carbon fuel source on site. And the reason that in the dense downtown we see more geo exchange, and it's because that's one of those sources that you can incorporate into a building, and you can retrofit it in as well. But if you want to use solar PV, for example, which could have great advantages, you might have more opportunities to do that outside the dense urban core.
And I would agree with you. And I mean, the technologies that we're using now are available anywhere. They're not urban centric, and there's certainly lots of opportunity to use. In fact, maybe even more opportunity for some of the renewables, including wind, that you can't do in a really dense urban area.
One more question from the audience here. It's worrisome that we're still providing credits for compensation for continued use of carbon heavy materials. Is there an appetite for actual zero buildings in the future? It's a big question.
Could you repeat that question?
Sure. It's worrisome that we're still providing credits for compensation of continued use of carbon heavy materials. Is there any appetite for actual zero buildings in the future?
I think there's an appetite,
Yeah.
But it's, again, it's the demonstration projects. So, how you can build a high-rise multifamily building, 30-story building with no embodied carbon. And there are steps, Tom talked about lower carbon concrete, and I think eventually we'll get to net positive concrete. Yeah, I think that's an aspiration and a necessity coming forward, but I don't see it as a current reality.
Oh,
Yeah, I'd point out as sort of a person who's involved in commercializing technology, this is why it's very dangerous to think about technological magic bullets, right? Inventing something doesn't mean it's deployed at a scale that's relevant. Vaclav Smil has pointed out time and time again that you can invent a better, faster, cheaper energy source. It takes 25 to 50 years to replace the old one. That's infrastructure. In the built environment, there are, the structural integrity of Portland cement. I mean, it's just people don't want to take the professional risk of, getting outside Portland cement. If you're building a bridge, you don't want it to fall down. Like, climate change is not your primary concern when you're building a bridge. It's the integrity of the bridge. So there are lots of reasons why inventing something like Blue Planet's carbon negative aggregate or whatever it's going to be takes time. It takes time to permeate the market. And that's why it's really important that we think long term about this stuff and we deploy what we can. We bring new stuff into play, but it takes policy. It takes talking one-on-one with people. It takes a whole lot of things to get next generation technologies deployed. It's not enough to invent it. There are no magic bullets. We have to deploy what we have. And the hard work is in all the soft engagement, right? The people, the regulations, the laws, the policy. That's where the heavy lift is. It's not technology. I'm a technology guy. And I'm telling you, it's not technology. It's not. 90% of the work is deploying it at scale on a time frame that matters to our kids. That's the challenge. That's why it's not that easy just to say, let's just have zero carbon buildings, because it's a lot harder than just pointing to a technology that can do it and saying we're done.
One small thing I'll just add is that, many municipalities are relooking at their parking requirements for a variety of reasons. And, there's a nice synergy between reducing parking requirements, reducing embodied carbon, because of the majority of that, or a lot of that concrete is in the parking structure, and the embodied carbon emissions is there. And of course, sustainable transportation as well, having access to transit, et cetera, and people having lower car use.
Joanne, you want to give a quick comment on that question?
Oh, I've actually lost the question. I'm just listening to everybody's answers in terms of, the carbon future, but I honestly, I'm very optimistic in many ways for what we can do. And, it isn't about technology. We have all the technology we need right now. I am looking forward to new technology, but as you know, there is risk, and all of that needs to be tested and tried and assured. But there's absolutely nothing to stop us now. There's momentum. There's a lot of great examples in Europe too. They're a decade ahead of us in terms of what they've been doing, and the West Coast is pretty advanced as well. So I think the opportunity to learn from each other and to continue to develop net zero buildings, it's all there. We just need to get some political will and some collective will across the board in terms of private and public sector, and we can do a lot.
Well, I like that optimistic statement. In fact, you said I'm very optimistic. I think that's the perfect note to end this on. Unfortunately, we're out of time. So many great ideas shared this morning. Thank you so much to all the panelists for being here today. And thank you to the audience for joining us as well.
Thank you very much.
Linda.
Thank you.